The smell reached him long before the marsh came into view. And it was wrong. Not just rot, not just the slow decay of something left too long in wet earth, but something sharper, something that clung to the air like iron and old blood. And Ronan Vaughan slowed his shag only slightly as the ground beneath him softened. With each step, the forest thinning out into a stretch of black water and dead reeds that whispered against each other in the wind, the kind of place where sound carried strangely, where distance felt uncertain and shapes shifted. When you stared at them too long, he stopped at the edge of the marsh, his eyes scanning the surface where patches of stagnant water reflected the gray sky above, broken by clusters of dark vegetation and half-sunken trees. And for a moment, everything seemed still too still, until a faint ripple spread across one of the pools, then faded just as quickly as it had appeared, as if whatever had caused it had sunk back beneath the surface before it could be seen. Ronan inhaled slowly, the air thick and damp filling his lungs, and leaving behind that metallic taste that told him enough. This was not a place where things simply died. This was a place where something fed the path behind him had ended some time ago, replaced by narrow strips of firmer ground, barely visible between the water and mud. And he followed them, without hesitation. His boots sinking slightly with each step, the soft suction of the marsh pulling at him as if trying to drag him down into it. And he adjusted his balance instinctively, moving with care, not because he feared the terrain, but because anything that lived here would use it to its advantage. The village appeared ahead of him. Eventually, if it could still be called that, a handful of structures raised on uneven wooden stilts, connected by narrow walkways that creaked under his weight. As he approached most of them, dark, empty doors, hanging open windows, broken or covered from the inside. And yet, there were signs of life, recent ones, a rope tied too tight, a lantern still hanging unlit, a set of footprints leading from one house to another, then stopping abruptly at the edge of the platform, as if the person had simply stepped off into the water below. Ronan crouched, slightly studying the marks, his fingers brushing against the damp wood where the prints ended. No struggle, no dragging, no blood. Just absence. And that told him more than any corpse could, because whatever was taking them did not need to chase, did not need to fight. It came from below, sudden and final. A low sound echoed across the marsh, then distant, but clear enough to catch his attention. Something between a wet exhale and a choke, and Ronan's head turned toward it instantly, his gaze locking onto a cluster of reeds further out, where the water shifted again, this time slower, heavier, as if something large moved just beneath the surface, and then it stopped, leaving only ripples that spread outward, before fading into stillness. Once more he stood slowly, his hand resting near the hilt of his blade, but not drawing it yet, because striking blindly in a place like this was a good way to lose more than just time. The walkway beneath him creaked again as he moved deeper into the village, each step deliberate, each glance measured as he checked the structures one by one. The interiors all told the same story, abandoned in haste but not in panic, tools left behind, food untouched, beds still made, and yet no bodies. No signs of struggle, only the lingering presence of something that had passed through, again and again, taking what it wanted and leaving nothing behind, until he reached the last structure at the far edge of the platform. The door closed unlike the others, and that alone made him pause for a second before pushing it open slowly, the hinges groaning softly as the interior revealed itself, dim, narrow, and occupied. A man sat inside, slumped against the wall, his skin pale and stretched thin over bone, his clothes soaked through as if he had been dragged from the water. Not. Long ago, his breathing shallow, uneven, each inhale wet and labored, and when his eyes lifted to meet Ronan's, they were filled with something worse than fear. They were empty, as if whatever had happened here had already taken most of him with it. Ronan stepped inside the floor, creaking under his weight, and stopped a few paces away from the man. "How many?" he asked, his voice low, steady. The man swallowed hard, his throat working painfully as he tried to speak. At first, nothing came out, only a broken rasp, until finally the words forced their way through. "Not many," he whispered. "It comes at night." "No," he corrected himself after a second. "It comes whenever it wants." Ronan's gaze sharpened slightly from where the man's clothes clung to his body. Dark stains spread across the fabric. Not blood, not entirely water, mixed with something thicker, something darker. "What is it?" Ronan asked, and the man's lips trembled as his eyes flicked toward the open doorway, then back again, as if afraid it might already be there, listening, waiting. It was a man. Once he said, barely louder than a breath, "They say he drowned, years ago, dragged under by the marsh. But the marsh didn't take him. It changed him." Ronan said nothing, but the silence pressed the man to continue. "It doesn't breathe." He added, his voice cracking. "It waits below, and when it takes you, it doesn't kill you right away." And that was when Ronan saw it clearly. The wound at the man's neck, a deep, uneven cut. Not clean, not careful, but deliberate. The edges darkened, as if something had been opened and left that way for a reason. And the man noticed his vzglad following it, because his hand moved weakly to cover the wound. But it was too late. He already knew it. "Lets the water in." The man whispered, "It fills you up, until you can't fight anymore, until you stop moving. And then it takes the skin." Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly, and the man let out a broken sound that might have been a laugh, if there had been anything left in him to feel. "It wears us," he said, his voice hollow, like a suit, like a thing it can walk in. And for a moment the room fell silent again, except for the faint sound of water shifting outside, soft and slow, and then something struck the underside of the platform below them, heavy enough to rattle the structure just slightly. Not enough to break it, but enough to remind them both that whatever was out there was close, very close, and it was not waiting for night to come back again. And Ronan Vorn knew this hunt would not be like the last one, because this time the monster was not just building itself, it was hiding inside what it took, and that made it harder to see and even harder to kill. The impact beneath the platform did not come again, but the water outside did not settle either. It moved slowly in uneven circles, as if something large remained just below the surface, shifting its weight without rising. And Ronan stood still for a moment, listening, not to the man behind him, but to the marsh itself, because places like this spoke in patterns, if you knew how to hear them. And what he heard now was wrong. Not the natural rhythm of water and wind, but something deliberate, something that paused when he moved and stirred, when he didn't, and that meant it was aware of him, already aware, and waiting. The man behind him let out a weak breath that rattled in his chest. "You should leave," he whispered. "It knows when someone new comes, Ronan did not turn. His gaze remained fixed on the water beyond the doorway. If it knew he was here, then leaving would only give it time to choose a better moment. And creatures that hunted from hiding always chose the moment that favored them most. So instead, he stepped forward out onto the narrow walkway again, the wood damp beneath his boots, his posture steady as he scanned the surface more carefully, now looking not for movement, but for absence, places where the water did not behave as it should, and he found it near a cluster of broken reeds, where the reflection of the sky should have been smooth, but instead appeared slightly darker, slightly distorted, as if something beneath interrupted it. Without fully breaking through, Ronan crouched slowly, his hand reaching down not to touch the water, but to hover just above it, feeling the cold that rose from below, sharper there than anywhere else, as if the thing beneath held it in place. And for a brief moment the surface shifted, just enough for him to see a shape pass under it. Long, uneven, not moving like a fish or any natural creature, but dragging itself forward with slow, controlled effort, and then it was gone again, leaving only ripples that spread outward before fading into stillness. He straightened immediately, stepping back from the edge, because now he knew where it was, or at least where it had been, and that was enough to begin building the rest of the pattern. It stayed close to the structures, close to the walkways. It did not wander far into the open water, which meant it used the village as cover, as hunting ground, as a place where prey came to it, instead of the other way around. And that made sense if it had once been a man. It would remember things like that, remember how people moved where they felt safe, and how to take advantage of it. A faint creak sounded to his left, and Ronan turned sharply, his eyes locking onto one of the other walkways, where a door that had been closed before now stood slightly open, moving just enough to catch the wind. Except there was no wind, not strong enough to shift it like that. And the movement came again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if something inside had brushed against it. Ronan stepped toward it, without hesitation, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, but still not drawing it, because striking too soon would only force the creature back into the water. And once it was there, fully hidden, the advantage would be lost. The boards beneath him groaned softly, with each step, the sound carrying farther than he would have liked. But there was no avoiding that here, not on structures, this old and weakened, and when he reached the doorway, he paused just long enough to listen. A faint wet sound came from within, uneven, shallow-like breathing through fluid, and Ronan pushed the door open, fully revealing the interior. Dark and narrow, much like the last. But this one was not empty. A figure stood at the far side. Its back turned, its posture rigid, as if frozen in place. Water dripping steadily from its clothes, forming a thin pool at its feet. And for a moment, Ronan did not move, because something about the stillness was wrong. Not the kind of stillness that came from fear, but the kind that came from waiting. The figure shifted slightly, its head tilting just enough for him to see the side of its face. Pale, stretched, the skin clinging too tightly to the bone beneath. And then it spoke its voice, low, broken, familiar. Help me, and Ronan's grip tightened slightly, because he had heard that voice before. Not from this man, not exactly, but from the one behind him. The same tone, the same hollow edge, as if whatever stood here had learned how to mimic it. Not perfectly, but close enough to deceive someone less careful. The figure took a step toward him, its movement stiff, unnatural, the joints bending with a slight delay, as if controlled by something that did not quite understand how they should work. And as it came closer, Ronan saw it clearly. The neck, the same wound opened, and dark water seeping from it with every movement. And beneath the torn skin, something shifted, something that did not belong to a human body at all. And that was when it lunged, sudden and violent, the false weakness gone in an instant, as its arms snapped forward far faster than they should have been, aiming to grab, to pull him close. And Ronan reacted immediately, stepping back and drawing his blade in one fluid motion, the steel flashing as he brought it across the figure's arm, severing it cleanly at the elbow, the limb falling uselessly to the floor. But no blood followed, only that same dark water spilling out in a slow, thick stream. And the thing did not stop. It did not even recoil properly. It simply continued forward, its other arm reaching again, its mouth opening wider than it should have been, as a low choking sound forced its way out, and Ronan stepped to the side, letting it pass, before striking again, this time at the neck, the blade cutting through what remained of the already opened wound, and the head dropped with a dull impact, rolling slightly across the floor. But even then, the body did not collapse immediately. It took another step, then another, before finally crumpling in on itself, the movement ending all at once as whatever held it together slipped free, and Ronan stood still for a moment, watching it carefully, his eyes narrowing as he studied the inside of the severed neck, where something had been not anymore, but recently something that had filled the space where life should have been, and then left when the body was no longer useful. He turned slowly, his gaze shifting back toward the marsh outside, because now the truth was clearer. The thing did not just hunt from the water it used. What it took, it wore them, moved through the village without being seen, without being stopped. And if it had done that once, it could do it again, which meant any of the structures around him could already hold another one, waiting. Another body filled with something that did not belong. And as that thought settled, the water outside shifted once more, this time closer, louder, and Ronan Vaughan knew he was no longer hunting something beneath the marsh. He was surrounded by it. Ronan did not remain inside the structure after that, because staying in enclosed spaces against something that could wear a body was a mistake that only had to be made once, and he had no intention of learning that lesson the hard way. So he stepped back out onto the walkway, his gaze moving constantly now from door to door, from shadow to shadow. Not just listening for movement, but watching for the smallest delay, the smallest unnatural pause in how things settled. Because whatever this creature was, it could mimic the living, but not perfectly, not yet, and those imperfections were the only warning he would get. The water below shifted again, closer this time, pressing softly against the stilts beneath him, as if testing them, feeling for weakness. And Ronan moved along the narrow path, with controlled speed, his boots landing lightly despite the old wood beneath him, because he needed space, needed visibility, and most of all, he needed to force the creature to reveal itself in its true form, not hidden inside something stolen, but exposed where it could be understood and killed. A faint sound reached him. Then from behind one of the nearby structures, a low dragging noise, followed by the wet slap of something being pulled across wood, and he changed direction immediately, stepping toward it. without hesitation, his hand tightening on the hilt of his blade as he approached the corner. Slowly, his breathing steady, his posture low, and when he turned it, he saw it. Not the creature itself, but what it had left behind. Another body half stripped, the skin peeled away in sections, revealing muscle beneath dark and soaked. The limbs twisted as if they had been broken deliberately before the work began. And for a brief moment, Ronan simply watched the pattern again. The same careful cuts, the same deliberate removal, nothing wasted, nothing rushed. This was not frenzy. This was method. And that meant the creature was close because it did not abandon its work unless something had interrupted it or unless it had chosen to move to something better. A soft creak sounded above him, and Ronan's head snapped upward instantly, just in time to see movement on the roof of the structure beside him. Something shifting along the edge, low and uneven, and then dropping down behind him with a heavy impact that rattled the walkway beneath his feet. He turned as it rose into view. No disguise now, no stolen skin to hide behind. Just the thing itself, pulled from the water. Its form slick and dark, the surface of its body stretched, tight over layers of muscle that moved too smoothly for something that had once been human. Its arms long and ending in jagged bone fragments, where fingers should have been, and its throat open a wide, uneven gash that pulsed faintly with dark fluid as if it breathed through it. Instead of lungs, its face still carried traces of what it had been once, but twisted beyond recognition. The jaw extended too far, the eyes sunken and wrong, reflecting light in a dull, lifeless way. And when it moved, it did so with a sudden, violent speed, launching itself forward across the narrow space between them, its claws striking down toward Ronan's chest, and he met it, head-on. This time, his blade rising to intercept the strike, steel colliding with bone in a sharp, ringing impact that sent a jolt through his arm. But he held his ground, shifting his weight to absorb the force before driving forward, forcing the creature back a step, and then another, its footing unstable on the slick wood beneath them. And that was when it changed its approach, abandoning the direct attack. As its body dropped low, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, as it twisted sideways and slipped past him, with a speed that did not match its size, one of its claws catching his side as it passed, tearing through leather and biting into flesh, just enough to draw blood before it moved beyond him, and then it was behind him again, turning fast, far faster than before, and Ronan barely had time to pivot as it came at him from the side. This time its movements unpredictable, shifting between lunges and sudden stops, as if it were testing him, learning his reactions, adjusting with each exchange, and that made it more dangerous than anything else he had faced here. Not because of its strength, but because it was thinking, while it fought, adapting in real time, and he could not allow that to continue. He stepped back toward the wider section of the walkway, drawing it away from the cluster of structures, forcing it into a space where it could not use the walls or the roofs to its advantage, and the creature followed immediately, not hesitating, not slowing its movements, growing sharper, more focused, as if it understood the shift and accepted it. And then it struck again, faster than before, its claws slashing in a rapid sequence, aimed not to kill outright, but to wear him down, to force mistakes. And Ronan blocked the first, deflected the second, but the third slipped through, grazing his arm, leaving a shallow but burning line across the skin. And he responded instantly, stepping in close where its reach was less effective, his blade driving toward the open wound at its throat, and the steel sank in, deep, cutting through the exposed flesh, and for a moment the creature recoiled violently, its body jerking, as that same choking sound burst from it, louder, harsher, but it did not fall. It did not slow. Instead, it lashed out again, blindly, its limbs striking with raw force, one catching Ronan across the shoulder, sending him back several steps, as pain flared through him and he steadied himself quickly, refusing to give it the advantage of distance, because if it reached the water again, even for a moment, the fight would change completely, and he would lose control of it. The creature paused, then just for a second, its head tilting slightly, as if studying him again, reassessing. And then its posture shifted its weight, lowering its limbs, spreading slightly, as it prepared to move not toward him but past him, back toward the edge of the walkway. And Ronan saw the intent immediately. It was not retreating, it was repositioning, trying to draw him closer to the water, where it held the advantage, where it could disappear and strike from below. And he moved to block it, stepping into its path before it could reach the edge. His blade raised his stance firm, and for the first time since the fight began, the creature hesitated. Not out of fear, but calculation, as if it understood that this path would not work, and that meant it would choose another one. And whatever that was, Ronan. Vorn knew it would be worse. Ronan held his ground as the creature stilled in front of him, because that hesitation was not weakness. It was thought, and thought made it dangerous, in ways that brute strength never could. The marsh around them shifted softly, the water pressing against the stilts in slow, uneven pulses, as if responding to the thing's presence, as if it were not just hiding within it, but bound to it in some deeper way. And that idea settled quickly in Ronan's mind, because everything he had seen so far pointed to the same truth. This was not a beast that had claimed the marsh. This was something the marsh itself had changed, shaped into what it now was, the open wound at its throat, the way it did not bleed properly, the way water seemed to move through it instead of around it. All of it spoke of something that no longer lived in the way men did, but had not fully died either. And that meant its weakness would not be found in the same places as before. Not in the heart, not in the lungs, not in anything that relied on breath or blood. The creature shifted again, then its limbs adjusting its posture, lowering further, as if preparing to spring. But its gaze did not leave him, not for a second. Those dull, sunken eyes fixed on him with something that was not rage, not hunger, but recognition, as if it understood what he was and why he had come. And for a moment Ronan considered the possibility that somewhere inside that ruined form there was still a fragment of the man it had once been. But he dismissed it just as quickly, because whatever had remained was no longer enough to matter. The thing in front of him was something else now, something that used what it had been, but was no longer bound by it, and that made it worse, because it did not hesitate, because of memory or doubt. It hesitated only to choose the most effective way to kill him. The boards beneath them creaked again, as the creature took a slow step to the side, testing the space, measuring the distance between them and the edge of the walkway, and Ronan mirrored the movement without thinking, keeping himself between it and the water, because if it slipped past him, even once, this would turn into a hunt instead of a fight. And in the marsh, it would always have the advantage. A faint ripple spread outward from beneath the platform. Again, this time stronger. The water rising slightly, as if something below pushed against it. And Ronan's eyes narrowed, because that movement did not match the creature in front of him. Not entirely, it was too broad, too slow, and that meant one thing: he was not dealing with a single presence. Not truly the thing in front of him was part of it, but not all of it. The marsh itself held the rest. And that realization struck hard and fast because it explained everything. The way it moved between bodies, the way it abandoned them when damaged, the way it returned to the water again and again. It did not need to survive in one form, because its true form was not the body it wore. It was the thing beneath the surface, the thing that filled those bodies and left them behind when they broke. And if that was true, then killing what stood in front of him would not end it. Not completely. The creature lunged again, cutting through his thoughts with sudden violence, its claws driving toward him in a sharp downward arc, and Ronan met it with equal force, his blade rising to intercept, before twisting inward, turning defense into attack as he drove forward once more, not aiming to disable. Not this time, but to destroy the body entirely, to force whatever controlled it out into the open, where it could be seen, where it could be struck. And the steel cut deep through the creature's torso, splitting the stretched flesh and cracking through the bone beneath. And the reaction was immediate. The body convulsed violently, its limbs jerking in broken motions, as that choking sound burst from its ruined throat louder than before. And Ronan did not stop. He struck again and again. Each blow, precise, controlled, aimed to break the structure apart faster than it could adapt, until finally the body gave way, collapsing in on itself, as the force holding it together slipped loose and the thing dropped heavily to the walkway, its form unraveling into nothing more than torn flesh and scattered bone. But even as it fell, Ronan was already turning, because he knew it would not end there. Not like this. And he saw it. Then the water, beneath the platform, rising. Not in waves, not in ripples, but in a slow, thick swell, as something beneath it gathered itself, drawing inward, before pushing up. And for the first time since entering the marsh, Ronan saw the truth of it. Not just a shape beneath the surface, but a mass, something that did not hold a single form, but shifted constantly. A dark fluid presence threaded with fragments of bone and scraps of flesh suspended within it, like remnants of everything it had taken and discarded. And as it pressed upward against the waterline, it began to take shape again. Not fully, not yet, but enough for him to understand the bodies were tools, nothing more vessels. It used to move above the surface to reach what it could not otherwise take. And the real creature, the thing that needed to be killed, was still below, still hidden in the marsh itself. And that changed the fight entirely, because steel could not cut water. Not cleanly, not enough to matter. And Ronan Vorn knew then that if he did not find a way to bring that thing fully out of the marsh, or force it into a form, he could strike. This hunt would not end with victory. It would end with him being dragged under, just like all the others, and becoming nothing more than another shape for it to wear. Ronan did not step back when the water began to rise, because retreating now would only give the thing what it wanted: space distance time to sink and return on its own terms. And he had already seen what happened when it was allowed to choose how the hunt unfolded. So instead he moved forward, stepping to the very edge of the walkway, his eyes fixed on the shifting mass beneath the surface as it gathered itself, drawing bone and flesh inward as if preparing to form another body. And that was the moment he had been waiting for. Not when it was whole, not when it was hidden, but when it was in between. Neither fully one thing nor the other, because that was where it would be weakest. The marsh churned slowly below him, the dark shape pressing closer to the surface fragments of what it had taken visible now. Suspended within it ribs, pieces of skull, torn lengths of sinew, all moving together as if guided by a single will. And Ronan exhaled once, steady and controlled, as he adjusted his grip on the blade, before stepping off the walkway and into the water. The cold hit instantly sharp enough to bite through leather and cloth alike. But he did not hesitate. Wading forward until the marsh reached his waist, the thick mud pulling at his legs with every step. As the thing beneath reacted to his presence immediately, the water surging around him not violently, but with purpose closing in, as if to surround him, to pull him down, and end it quickly, before he could act. And Ronan moved faster, then pushing through the resistance, forcing himself deeper, until the surface broke around him, and the thing rose to meet him, its mass shifting upward, forming a crude shape in front of him. Not stable, not complete, but enough something like a torso, something like arms reaching toward him made of water and bone and flesh, all bound together by that same unnatural force. And when it struck, it did not slash or grab it. Engulfed the surface, collapsing over him in a heavy wave that drove the air from his lungs and forced him under the water, the world turning dark and silent. In an instant, the cold closing in from all sides as the weight of the marsh pressed against him, and something moved within it, wrapping around him, tightening, pulling him deeper. But Ronan did not fight the pull, not the way it expected. Instead, he let himself sink just enough to find it, the core, not visible. Not clearly, but there a denser point within the mass, something that held the rest together. And he drove the blade toward it, with everything he had. The steel cutting through, resistance thicker than water, but softer than bone, pushing deeper, until it struck something solid. Something that pushed back against the blade, as if aware of the threat. And he did not stop. He forced it further, twisting the weapon hard within the mass, and the reaction was immediate, violent. The water around him convulsed, the pressure tightening suddenly, before releasing all at once, as the structure holding it together faltered, and Ronan pulled himself upward, breaking the surface with a sharp breath, as the marsh erupted around him, not in waves but in collapse. The mass that had risen moments before, losing its shape, falling apart, as the fragments within it scattered, drifting without direction, as the force binding them together began to fail. He staggered back toward the walkway, his movements heavy as he pulled himself up onto the wood water pouring from his odejda, as he turned back to watch the marsh below. And for a moment it still moved, small ripples spreading outward, as if something remained. But then those too began to fade. The surface, settling slowly, returning to the same stagnant stillness it had held before. And Ronan stood there, breathing steady, his gaze fixed on the place where it had been waiting for any sign of movement, any attempt to reform. But none came. The thing beneath the marsh was gone. Whatever had driven it, whatever had allowed it to take shape and move and hunt, had been broken from within, and without that core. It was nothing more than water and rot, and the scattered remains of those it had taken and left behind. The silence that followed was different now. Not empty, not wrong, just quiet. The kind of quiet that belonged to a place after something had ended and would not return. Ronan remained there a moment longer before turning back toward the village. The structures still standing, but lifeless, the last of what had once been a place where people lived now, nothing more than wood and memory. And he walked through it once more, not searching, not expecting to find anyone left, because he already knew there would be none. The marsh had taken everything it could, and now there was nothing left for it to claim. The man in the house did not breathe. When Ronan passed by again, his body still and cold, the wound at his throat dark and empty. Now no longer leaking, no longer feeding anything, and Ronan did not stop. He stepped past him and continued toward the path he had come from the ground, firmer with each step. As he left the water behind, the smell of iron, fading slowly with distance, until only the damp scent of earth remained, and when he reached the edge of the marsh, he paused just once, his gaze shifting back over the dark stretch of water, now still and silent, as if it had never held anything at all. And for those who did not know what to look for, it would seem that way, a place where people had simply vanished, without reason, without cause. But Ronan Vorn knew better, because he had seen what lived beneath the surface, and what it took to kill it. And as he turned away from the marsh and stepped back into the forest, he did not look back again, because places like this did not stay empty for long. And sooner or later something else would come to fill what had been left behind. And when it did, he would be there waiting, as he always was, because the world did not change, and neither did he. And in the end, that was the only thing that kept the darkness from swallowing everything whole.